All right, welcome to our next video for our series in programming in Java. This is a big one. This is an introduction to objects, classes, and object-oriented programming. Hopefully at this point, you've gotten pretty comfortable with building one file, one Java file's worth of code, and you've probably taken on projects now that could be 2, 3, 4, 500 lines of code. And the problem that we're going to solve today is how do we handle code that's getting too large, it's getting too big. We don't want to have thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code in one file if we can handle it. So how do we split that up? How do we use multiple Java files to help with one program? And the idea is we're going to make two classes to start with. One's going to be called the client class, and the other one's going to be called a helper class. And we're going to see that by putting some of our code in a helper class, it can help support better organization, better readability, better programs overall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate that we are making some software for, let's say we've started running a dog kennel. And we offer, daycare and boarding, and dogs come over, and we want to keep track of who we have at our kennel. So the idea is I'm going to make this class. I'm going to call it kennel. I'm going to give it a main method. And the idea here is I want to keep track of the various dogs that come into my employment. So maybe, a dog walks in, and its name is, I'll go with my dog's name, it's Boomer. Boomer's a good boy. And let's say we got to have an age, that could be a double, but I'm going to make it an int for right now. We'll say that's 2. And they want to know whether or not at the kennel that Boomer's been vaccinated. I'll just simulate that with maybe Vax. Yeah, sure, Vax. And my wife is a veterinarian, so Boomer has definitely been vaccinated. So here it is. I've got this information that I've been able to store. It takes care of Boomer. But it occurs to me there's a lot of pieces of information I could store about Boomer, right? We could have weight. We could have whether or not he's been neutered. We could have what quantity or type of dog food he eats. We could store a whole bunch of information. So I have just 3 variables here right now, but we could easily see a world where there might be more. Well, what happens when another dog wants to come into my clinic, right? So I might have string name 2, and this dog's name is McCoy. And then, we want to have an age, let's say McCoy is like 10 years old, and so on and so forth. Well, I might find myself declaring 3 or 4 or 5, 6 or more variables for every one of these dogs that comes into my kennel. And you can see pretty quickly it becomes a really big mess to try to handle having all these variables in one place. It just is kind of rough. So if we find ourselves having this concept like a dog that represents certain values of information we'd like to store, sometimes it makes sense to make a separate class whose job it is to handle everything that we care about that has to do with the dog. Maybe kennel will care about how many facilities we have for the dogs and how we charge for money and things like that. But when it comes to the dog's information, let's store that in a dog class. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to go ahead and make a second class. This might be the first time you've ever done this. And you're going to notice I do not put a main method in here. So I'm going to say finish, and I'm going to drag this so you can see it. So I've got a kennel class and a dog class. They're going to look a little bit different. So let's start defining some terminology for this video. We would say that the kennel is the client class. I call it the client class. You can think of it as a client program. It is going to contain the main method and needs to use helper classes. So if you are relying on other classes for help, then you are a client. And in this particular model, the kennel is the client class. I'm going to define dog as a helper class. We are used by the client. And what's funny? It is technically true that you could have helper classes that assist other helper classes, and there's large degrees of complexity we can get into with this, but we'll set that aside for right now, just try and keep it basic. Whenever I make a helper class, I always can keep two pieces of information stored in here. One is called the state, and the other is called the behavior. So the state is made up of variables, and it really answers the question, what info must be stored for each dog? And in our case, we're going to say that every dog needs a name. We're going to say that every dog needs an age. We're going to say that every dog needs to know whether or not it's been vaccinated. Those are three things that we need to know. Because I'm using a helper class, it's not that difficult to add more variables, more to the state of this class. Like we said, we could include pounds of dog food, or whether or not it goes with the big dogs or the small dogs at playtime. There's all kinds of information we could store. But for simplicity, I'm sticking with just these three. So a helper class can contain state, and it can contain behavior. And the behavior are going to be the methods. For instance, maybe we need to determine whether or not a dog is geriatric. Maybe it's considered old. And, it turns out that depending on your breed, geriatric can mean a different thing, right? So if your breed is Great Dane, then geriatric can be the age of 6. But if you're like a good mid-sized mutt like my Boomer, then whether or not you are geriatric is, it's probably more like 12 or 13 by the time you're considered old. So let's say we wanted to just say, all right, I want to know if a dog is considered geriatric. I might say public Boolean is geriatric. And we're just going to return if age is over 8. We're going to define all dogs that are over the age of 8 are going to be considered geriatric. You're going to find that when it comes to state and behavior is often having to report or modify the state. So the job of the behavior is to report or modify the state. So we've kind of built out a very simple helper class. It stores some information. It can perform a task in that it can report information. So how do we use it? Well, what I can do is I can say, all right, dog, we'll call it dog D1, will be the first dog, equals new dog. And then what's cool is that name, that identifier D1, now holds all of the things that I've told any dog object. It can hold those things. So it's holding 3 variables for me, and it can perform a method. So what does that look like? If I wanted to set this, I could say D1 dot, and this is what dot accessing is. You say the name of the object, and then you put a dot, and you can put down the name of a variable, or you can put down the name of a method that you defined. You're going to notice in Eclipse that there are a bunch more methods here than the ones we defined. This is because our class inherits from something called the object class. It gets given a bunch of starter methods that we can't see. We're going to cover inheritance and the object class in another video, so I'll just ask you to ignore that for right now. So for right now, I'm going to say, you know what, let's go ahead and set the name. The name is going to be Boomer, and the age is going to be 2, and the vaccinated is going to be true. Vaccinated equals true. Okay. Now, I'm sure while you're looking at this, the first thing you'll think to yourself is, well, you didn't really save yourself any lines of code. Whenever you make a dog, you're having to expend one statement for each variable that you're trying to set. And we're going to see later that we're going to define constructors for our dog class, which, a reminder, we talked about constructors before with scanners. Constructors allow us to decide how an object is built when it's first initialized. So we know that the scanner had 3 different kinds of constructors that we used. One that took system.in as a parameter to receive input from the user, one that accepted strings so that we could tokenize strings, and one that accepted files so that we could tokenize files or do line-based processing on files. The same is going to be true for our helper classes. We're going to be allowed to set up constructors that determine what information must be provided when you create a new dog object. So even though this doesn't look like it's saving lines of code right now, I promise after the constructors video, it will save some lines of code. So let's introduce some more vocabulary. We've talked about that kennel is the client, dog is the helper. We've talked about within the helper, there is state and behavior. That's the variables that every dog object owns and the methods that every dog object can perform. This brings me back to what's the difference between an object and a class? Well, the class is the blueprint. It is the design from which we create a usable object. So in this case, dog is the class and D1 is the object. That is the difference between the two. And this is generally true for any variable that you've declared that's not primitive. For instance, string S, string is your class and S is your object. If I want to access the state or access the behavior of something, I need to do it through the object. So that is why you see me saying d1.name and d1.age and d1.vax. There is a way to access some of these features through the class. We might say dog.something, but that has to do with a keyword that we're going to discuss in a later video called static. So that's the summary for today. The reason why this is so powerful is this speaks to how Java is an object-oriented programming language. And by allowing us to organize our information into objects rather than a series of actions, we find an ability to increase our function, increase sort of the complexity and usefulness of our code without disrupting readability. It's eventually going to just look a lot nicer to say dog D1 equals new dog than it would be to declare 3 or 5 or 10 variables having to deal with all the state of this dog object. So that is a brief introduction to how to use multiple classes in your code, and we'll have more videos in this series so you can understand how to expand on this. Thanks for watching.